Well, Linda, we're here right at the holiday season in the end of 2016. I wanted to ask you, are there any particularly memorable gifts you've ever gotten in the spirit of the holidays? Any memorable Christmas gifts or whatever?
I don't remember. Mostly my family, we would give each other money or you would get to go eat out.
Never like a cool toy or anything?
One time, I don't know if it was my birthday or Christmas, but these people, and I don't even know who they were, they took me to Toys R Us and they let me pick any toy I wanted. And I bought the crappiest toy. But at the time, I was really thrilled. It was a dog that had wheels and feet that would move and quote unquote walk.
Wait a minute. Who are these people?
It was a battery-operated dog.
An Aibo?
I don't know. But, I mean, at first you're really excited, but after like 30 minutes as a kid, you're like really bored. So after that day, I don't think I played with it. And me and my sister, we make fun of it. I think my sister made fun of me being like, you picked the crappiest toy. And my sister, no, we gave it away. My sister picked a better one. She picked like a toy sewing machine. But it actually kind of sewed. It was just kind of like crappy sewing. Like it wasn't the best thread, but like we actually could sew with it. So Kim, my sister, picked the better toy.
Kim's been on the show.
Yes, my sister. What about your favorite gift ever?
I don't know if I have a favorite gift. To be honest with you, I think a couple of things are at play here. Number one, I have pretty humble needs. I don't expect a lot. Mostly I like books and technology and things like that. but also like, I'm someone who I hope this doesn't sound arrogant, but I can pretty much provide for myself, I guess. Maybe that aligns with me having humble needs.
You try and be independent.
Maybe. So I pretty much have most of the stuff I want. Or if there are things I want that I haven't bought for myself, it's very unlikely an outsider would understand what they are. I remember like when I was a kid, people found out I was interested in old-time radio. Do you even know about this?
You told me.
Okay. A common gift that I would get around the holidays was a little cassette pack of old-time radio episodes. And number one, I got that same cassette pack like 6 times from different people. And like overlaps too. I got it from the same relatives like multiple years in a row.
What?
And it was just like...
So wait, let me be clear. You gave it back to them and then they re-gifted it.
No. That's not polite. You have to be thankful. But also anything that's like, oh, you're going to find at Walmart's intro to old time radio. It's always like the surface level stuff that I already have or know about in my collection. So I'm not real big on like gift receiving, I guess. Yeah, pretty much like if I want something, it's either like obscure, like, oh, go get me a new Mark Waid graphic novel. And, not that many people, if you already know who he is, you're miles ahead. Most people wouldn't. I guess my most expensive hobby is the podcast.
So it's expensive?
No, I think it's actually pretty reasonable. I think it's a very under control hobby.
It's under control?
Yeah.
Just to be clear, I'm talking out of this new microphone
that
Kyle bought. And I think I saw the bill on the credit card.
Yeah. Well, yeah, but I mean, that mic will be good for a while now. You sound better. People will enjoy the show more.
I think I sounded good before.
Oh, matter of debate if you read the iTunes reviews, but yeah.
But anyways, I see on the bills Amazon Web Services. What's this about?
Well, I reduced the Amazon Web Services cost recently. I got rid of a bunch of the EC2 instances we use, and I deployed them into the Elastic Cloud. So I saved us a little bit of money there. So that'll go down.
But still, you're doing that. Aren't there transcripts? Where do these transcripts come from?
Oh, yeah. So if you go to dataskeptic.com, a lot of the episodes, not all of them, because I can't actually afford to do all the episodes, but some of them we transcribe so that people who are hard of hearing or deaf can enjoy the show, and also they're searchable and citable. People can quote them on Wikipedia because they're transcribed in text. That's some sort of rule over there.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
So now you transcribe podcasts sometimes.
Yeah.
I think you've been gone at conferences sometimes.
Yeah. It costs money to go to conferences. That's true.
Okay, traveling.
Right. Sometimes I could sleep on somebody's couch when people offer, but I still have to get into stuff to do coverage for the show.
And then we're in your little mini studio.
Right.
So we have like a room dedicated just to this podcast.
Yeah, we do. And it's coming along. There's still some renovations I need to do in here, but I'm just saving up for more of the foam tile and stuff like that.
Foam tile? You mean you want a better soundproof this room?
Yeah. So there's less of the hiss that people hear when they turn up their earbuds very
So
loud.
Kyle will have to be spending some money on that.
Yeah, that'll be okay, though. You won't mind.
I don't know. We'll see. So the way I see it, there's some money being spent out here.
It's just kind of like, an expensive hobby.
It's now an expensive hobby?
Yeah.
Wait, you said it wasn't expensive.
Well,
What about the sump pump?
Yeah, I'll get to that. Just let me get another mic, and then we'll get the sump pump going.
To be clear, the sump pump has nothing to do with the podcast.
Right, but yeah, that's true. No, okay, so you're right. It's gotten a little of a pricey hobby. So we are asking people who enjoy the show to support the show. Not everyone has to. Data Skeptic is and always will be a free podcast. But if you enjoy this, if you get value out of it, please head over to dataskeptic.com and consider becoming a member.
So what does it mean to be a member?
First, you sign up, and you can do it for very cheaply or very expensively if you're that sort of benefactor. We have a bunch of different levels. There's going to be special prizes and stuff that come out with time, but at just $3.99 or $4, I forget what we made it, but very affordable, like $1 an episode. You can sign up and support the show. That allows us to keep covering conferences, to do transcripts, to expand the show, to do some of these features like our recent shows on causal impact and stuff like that. We would really appreciate anyone in this season of giving who wants to support the show. Please head to dataskeptic.com and do so.
Or else. Kyle has to report to me.
Well, everyone already knows you're the boss, but what does that mean?
We will have to reassess this hobby.
Budget. Okay. All right. Well, we'll see about that. Maybe I'll just get enough supporters in the meantime. We can check in next year.
We'll check in.
But in all seriousness, for those of you who have been following along for a long time or a little bit of time, we like bringing you the show. We'll always be free, but we could really use your support to offset some of the costs of the hosting and the equipment, and also some of the plans we have to expand the show. That's our little pre-announcement. Now on to the main part of the show. Welcome everybody to the holiday special for Data Skeptic 2016. If you've been a listener since last year, and that's actually about half of you, you already know the deal with Christmas. I'll summarize it here. I gave a longer explanation last year. For whatever reason, around big holidays, people tend not to download podcasts in general. I've confirmed this with other creators as well. So I'm in this tough position. Do I bring a guest on, knowing full well that I'm asking them to volunteer their time and their message won't reach as many people? I mean, there are crueler things you can do, but it just didn't feel right. So I thought, why don't we, in the spirit of the holidays anyways, just have some special episodes, since I assume only the, truest of fans tune in at this time, I guess. So much like last year, I'm going to totally break format and do a reading here. Tonight, we're going to read Franchise by Isaac Asimov. This is a wonderful story I first read as a teenager, and although it's topical and related to things in the news, I have no hidden agenda or secret message here. This is just a story, take it how you will. It's also a little weird that a character's called Linda, but let's kick back and read Franchise. Linda, age 10, was the only one of the family who seemed to enjoy being awake. Norman Mueller could hear her now through his own drugged, unhealthy coma. He had finally managed to fall asleep an hour earlier, but even then, it was more like exhaustion than sleep. She was at his bedside now, shaking him. "Daddy, Daddy, wake up, wake up!" He suppressed a groan. "All right, Linda." "But Daddy, there's more policemen around than any time. Police cars and everything." Norman Mueller gave up and rose wearily to his elbows. The day was beginning. It was faintly stirring towards dawn outside, the germ of a miserable gray that looked about as miserable gray as he felt. He could hear Sarah, his wife, shuffling about breakfast duties in the kitchen. His father-in-law, Matthew, was hawking strenuously in the bathroom. No doubt Agent Hadley was ready and waiting for him. This was the day. To begin with, it had been like every other year, maybe a little worse, because it was a presidential year, but no worse than the other presidential years if it came to that. The politicians spoke about the great electorate and the vast electronic intelligence that was its servant. The press analyzed the situation with industrial computers. The New York Times and the St. Louis Post-Dispatch had their own computers and were full of little hints as to what could be forthcoming. Commentators and columnists pinpointed the crucial state and county in happy contradiction to one another. The first hint that it would not be like every other year was when Sarah Mueller said to her husband on the evening of October 4th, with Election Day exactly 1 month off, "Cantwell Johnson says that Indiana will be the state this year. He's the fourth one. Just think,
Our state this time. Matthew Hortonweiler took his fleshy face from behind the paper, stared dourly at his daughter, and growled. Those fellows are paid to tell lies. Don't listen to them. 4 of them, Father, said Sarah mildly. They all said Indiana. Indiana is a key state, Matthew, said Norman just as mildly, on account of the Hawkins-Smith Act and this mess in Indianapolis. Matthew twisted his old face alarmingly and rasped out, No one says Bloomington or Monroe County, do they? Well, said Norman. Linda, whose little pointed chin face had been shifting from one speaker to the next, said pipingly, You going to be voting this year, Daddy? Norman smiled gently and said, I don't think so, dear. But this was in the gradual growing excitement of an October in a presidential election year, and Sarah had led a quiet life with dreams for her companions. She said longingly, Wouldn't that be wonderful, though? If I voted? Norman Mueller had a small blonde mustache that had given him a debonair quality in the young Sarah's eyes, but which, with gradual graying, had declined merely to lack of distinction. His forehead bore deepening lines born of uncertainty, and, in general, he had never seduced his clerkly soul with the thought that he was either born great or would under any circumstance achieve greatness. He had a wife, a job, and a little girl, and except under extraordinary conditions of elation or depression, was inclined to consider that to be an adequate bargain struck with life. So he was a little embarrassed and more than a little uneasy at the direction his wife's thoughts were taking. Actually, my dear, he said, there are 200 million people in the country, and with odds like that, I don't think we ought to waste our time wondering about it. His wife said, Why, Norman, it's no such thing like 200 million, and you know it. In the first place, only people between 20 and 60 are eligible, and it's always men, so that puts it down to maybe 50 million to 1. Then if it's really Indiana, then it's about 1.25 million to 1. You wouldn't want me to bet in a horse race against those odds now, would you? Let's have supper. Matthew muttered from behind his newspaper. Damn foolishness. Linda asked again, You going to be voting this year, Daddy? Norman shook his head, and they all adjourned to the dining room. By October 20, Sarah's excitement was rising rapidly. Over the coffee, she announced that Mrs. Schultz, having a cousin who is the secretary of an assemblyman, said that all the, quote, smart money was on Indiana. She says President Villers is even going to make a speech at Indianapolis. Norman Mueller, who had had a hard day at the store, nudged the statement with a raising of eyebrows and let it go at that. Matthew Hortonweiler, who was chronically dissatisfied with Washington, said, If Villers makes a speech in Indiana, that means he thinks Multivac will pick Arizona. He wouldn't have the guts to go closer, the mushhead. Sarah, who ignored her father whenever she could decently do so, said, I don't know why they don't announce the state as soon as they can, and then the county, and so on. Then the people who were eliminated could relax. If they did that, pointed out Norman, the politicians would follow the announcements like vultures. By the time it was narrowed down to a township, you'd have a congressman or two at every street corner. Matthew narrowed his eyes and brushed angrily at his sparse gray hair. They're vultures, anyhow. Sarah murmured, Now, Father. Matthew's voice rumbled over her protest without as much as a stumble or hitch. Listen, I was around when they set up Multivac. It would end partisan politics, they said. No more voters' money wasted on campaigns. No more grinning nobodies, high-pressured and advertising campaigned into Congress or the White House. So what happens? More campaigning than ever. Only now they do it blind. They'll send guys to Indiana on account of the Hawkins-Smith Act, and other guys to California in case it's the Joe Hammer situation that turns out crucial. I say, wipe out all that nonsense. Back to good old, Linda asked suddenly, Don't you want Daddy to vote this year, Grandpa? Matthew glared at the young girl. Never you mind now. He turned back to Norman and Sarah. There was a time I voted, marched right up to the polling booth, stuck my fist on the lever and voted. There was nothing to it. I just said, This fellow's my man and I'm voting for him. That's the way it should be. Linda said excitedly, You voted, Grandpa? You really did? Sarah leaned forward to quiet what might easily become an incongruous story drifting about the neighborhood. It's nothing, Linda. Grandpa doesn't really mean voted. Everyone did that kind of voting. Your grandpa too. But it wasn't really voting. Matthew roared, It wasn't when I was a little boy. I was 22 and I voted for Langley, and it was real voting. My vote didn't count for much, maybe, but it was as good as anyone else's. Anyone else's. And no Multivac too, Norman imposed. All right, Linda, time for bed. And stop asking questions about voting. When you grow up, You'll understand all about it." He kissed her with antiseptic gentleness, and she moved reluctantly out of range until maternal prodding and a promise that she might watch the bedside video till 9:15 if she was prompt about the bathing ritual. Linda said, "Grandpa," and stood with her chin down and her hands behind her back until his newspaper lowered itself to the point where shaggy eyebrows and eyes, nested in fine wrinkles, showed themselves. It was October 31st. He said, "Yes?" Linda came closer and put both her forearms on one of the old man's knees so that he had to discard his newspaper altogether. She said, "Grandpa, did you really vote once?" He said, "You heard me say I did, didn't you? Do you think I tell fibs?" "No, but Mama says everybody voted then." "So they did. But how could they? How could everybody vote?" Matthew stared at her solemnly, then lifted her and put her on his knee. He even moderated the tonal qualities of his voice. He said, "You see, Linda, till about 40 years ago, everybody always voted. Say we wanted to decide who was to be the new president of the United States. The Democrats and the Republicans would both nominate someone, and everybody would say who they wanted. When election day was over, they would count how many people wanted the Democrat and how many wanted the Republican. Whoever had more votes was elected. You see?" Linda nodded and said, "How did all the people know who to vote for? Did Multivac tell them?" Matthew's eyebrows hunched down and he looked severe. "They just use their own judgment, girl." She edged away from him, and he lowered his voice again. "I'm not angry at you, Linda, but you see, sometimes it took all night to count what everyone said, and people were impatient. So they invented special machines which could look at the first few votes and compare them with the votes from the same place in the previous years. That way, the machines could compute how the total vote would be and who would be elected. You see?" She nodded. "Like Multivac. The first computers were much smaller than Multivac, but the machine grew bigger and they could tell how the election would go from fewer and fewer votes. Then, at last, they built Multivac, and it can tell from just one voter." Linda smiled at having reached a familiar part of the story and said, "That's nice." Matthew frowned and said, "No, it's not. I don't want a machine telling me how I would have voted just because some joker in Milwaukee says he's against higher tariffs. Maybe I want to vote cockeyed just for the pleasure of it. Maybe I don't want to vote. Maybe—" But Linda had wriggled from his knee and was beating a retreat. She met her mother at the door. Her mother, who was still wearing her coat and had not even time to remove her hat, said breathlessly, "Run along, Linda. Don't get in Mother's way." Then she said to Matthew, as she lifted her hat from her head and patted her hair back in place, "I've been at Agatha's." Matthew stared at her censoriously and did not even dignify that piece of information with a grunt as he groped for his newspaper. Sarah said, as she unbuttoned her coat, "Guess what she said?" Matthew flattened out his newspaper for reading purposes with a sharp crackle and said, "Don't much care." Sarah said, "Now, Father," but she had no time for anger. The news had to be told, and Matthew was the only recipient handy, so she went on, "Agatha's Joe is a policeman, you know. He says a whole truck of Secret Servicemen came into Bloomington last night. They're not after me." "Don't you see, Father? Secret Service agents, and it's almost election time. In Bloomington. Maybe they're after a bank robber." "There hasn't been a bank robbery in town in ages. Father, you're hopeless." She stalked away. Nor did Norman Mueller receive the news with noticeably greater excitement. "Now, Sarah, how did Agatha's Joe know they were Secret Service agents?" he asked calmly. "They wouldn't go around with identification cards pasted on their foreheads." But by next evening, with November a day old, she could say triumphantly, "It's just everyone in Bloomington that's waiting for someone local to be the voter. The Bloomington News as much as said so on video." Norman stirred uneasily. He couldn't deny it, and his heart was sinking. If Bloomington was really to be hit by Multivac's lightning, it would mean newspapermen, video shows, tourists, all sorts of strange upsets. Norman liked the quiet routine of his life, and the distant stir of politics was getting uncomfortably close. He said, "It's all rumor, nothing more." "You wait and see then. You just wait and see." As things turned out, there was very little time to wait, for the doorbell rang insistently, and when Norman Mueller opened it and said, "Yes," a tall, grave-faced man said, "Are you Norman Mueller?" Norman said, "Yes," again, but in a strange dying voice. It was not difficult to see from the stranger's bearing that he was one carrying authority, and the nature of his errand suddenly became as inevitably obvious as it had, until the moment before, been unthinkably impossible. The man presented credentials, stepped into the house, closed the door behind him, and said ritualistically, Mr. Norman Mueller, it is necessary for me to inform you on the behalf of the President of the United States that you have been chosen to represent the American electorate on November 4th, 2008. Norman Mueller managed, with difficulty, to walk unaided to his chair. He sat there, white-faced and almost insensible, while Sarah brought water, slapped his hand in a panic, and moaned to her husband between clenched teeth, "Don't be sick! Norman, don't be sick! They'll pick someone else!" When Norman could manage to talk, he whispered, "I'm sorry, sir." The Secret Service agent had removed his coat, unbuttoned his jacket, and was sitting at ease on the couch. "It's all right," he said, and the mark of officialdom seemed to have vanished with the formal announcement and leave him simply a large and rather friendly man. "This is the 6th time I've made the announcement, and I've seen all kinds of reactions. Not one of them was the kind you see on the video. You know what I mean. A wholly dedicated look and a character who says, 'It will be a great privilege to serve my country.' That sort of stuff." The agent laughed comfortingly. Sarah's accompanying laugh held a trance of shrill hysteria. The agent said, "Now you're going to have me with you for a while. My name is Phil Handley. I'd appreciate it if you call me Phil. Mr. Mueller can't leave the house any more till Election Day. You'll have to inform the department store that he's sick, Mrs. Mueller. You can go about your business for a while, but you'll have to agree not to say a word about this. Right, Mrs. Mueller?" Sarah nodded vigorously. "No, sir, not a word." "All right, but Mrs. Mueller," Handley looked grave. "We're not kidding now. Go out only if you must, and you'll be followed when you do. I'm sorry, but that's the way we operate." "Followed? It won't be obvious, don't worry. And it's only 2 days till the formal announcement to the nation is made." "Your daughter, she's in bed," said Sarah hastily. "Good. She'll have to be told I'm a relative or friend staying with the family. If she does find out the truth, she'll have to be kept in the house. Your father had better stay in the house in any case." "He won't like that," said Sarah. "Can't be helped. Now since you have no others living with you, you know all about us apparently," whispered Norman. "Quite a bit," agreed Handley. "In any case, those are all my instructions to you for the moment. I'll try to cooperate as much as I can and be as little of a nuisance as possible. The government will pay for maintenance, so I won't be an expense to you. I'll be relieved every night by someone who will sit up in this room, so there will be no problem about sleeping accommodations. Now, Mr. Mueller?" "Sir?" "You can call me Phil," said the agent again. "The purpose of the 2-day preliminary before formal announcement is to get you used to your position. We prefer to have you face multivac in as normal a state of mind as possible. Just relax and try to feel like it's all in a day's work, okay?" "Okay," said Norman, and then shook his head violently. "But I don't want the responsibility. Why me?" "All right," said Handley. "Let's get that straight to begin with. Multivac weighs all sorts of factors, billions of them. One factor isn't known, though, and won't be known for a long time. That's the reaction pattern of the human mind. All Americans are subject to the molding pressure of what other Americans do and say, to the things that are done to him and the things he does to others. Any American can be brought to multivac to have the bent of his mind surveyed. From that, the bend of all minds in the country can be estimated. Some Americans are better for that purpose than others at some given time, depending upon the happenings of the year. Multivac picked you as most representative this year. Not the smartest, or the strongest, or the luckiest, but just the most representative. Now, we don't question Multivac, do we?" "Couldn't it make a mistake?" asked Norman. Sarah, who listened impatiently, interrupted to say, "Don't listen to him, sir. He's just nervous, you know. Actually, he's very well read, and he always follows politics very closely." Handley said, "Multivac makes the decisions, Mrs. Mueller. It picked your husband." "But does it know everything?" insisted Norman wildly. "Couldn't it have made a mistake?" "Yes, it can. There's no point not being frank. In 1993, a selected voter died of a stroke 2 hours before it was time for him to be notified. Multivac didn't predict that. It couldn't. The voter might be mentally unstable, morally unsuitable, or, for that matter, disloyal. Multivac can't know everything about everybody until he's fed all the data there is. That's why alternative selections are always held in readiness. I don't think we'll be using one this time. You're in good health, Mr. Mueller, and you've been carefully investigated. You qualify." Norman buried his face in his hands and sat motionless. "By tomorrow morning, sir," said Sarah, "he'll be perfectly all right. He just has to get used to it, that's all." "Of course," said Handley. In the privacy of their bedchamber, Sarah Mueller expressed herself in an other and stronger fashion. The burden of her lecture was, "So get hold of yourself, Norman. You're trying to throw away the chance of a lifetime." Norman whispered desperately, "It frightens me, Sarah, the whole thing. For goodness sake, why? What's there to it but answering a question or two? The responsibility is too great. I couldn't face it." "What responsibility? There isn't any. Multivac picked you. It's Multivac's responsibility. Everyone knows that." Norman sat up in bed in a sudden excess of rebellion and anguish. "Everyone is supposed to know that. But they don't. They lower your voice," hissed Sarah icily. "They'll hear you downtown." "They don't," said Norman, declining quickly to a whisper. "When they talk about the Ridgely administration in 1988, do they say he won them over with pie-in-the-sky promises and racist baloney? No. They talk about the goddamn Macomber vote, as though Humphrey Macomber was the man who had anything to do with it because he faced Multivac. I've said it myself, only now I think the poor guy was just a truck farmer who didn't ask to be picked. Why was it his fault more than anyone else's? Now his name is a curse." "You're just being childish," said Sarah. "I'm being sensible. I tell you, Sarah, I won't accept. They can't make me vote if I don't want to. I'll say I'm sick. I'll say—" But Sarah had had enough. "Now you listen to me," she whispered in a cold fury. "You don't have only yourself to think about. You know what it means to be voter of the year. A presidential year at that. It means publicity and fame, and maybe buckets of money. And then I go back to being a clerk. You will not. You'll have a branch managership at least if you have any brains at all, and you will have, because I'll tell you what to do. You control the kind of publicity if you play your cards right. And you can force Kennel Stores, Inc. into a tight contract and an escalator clause in connection with your salary, and a decent pension plan. That's not the point of being voters, Sarah. That will be your point. If you don't owe anything to yourself or to me, I'm not asking you for myself. You owe something to Linda." Norman groaned. "Well, don't you?" snapped Sarah. "Yes, dear," muttered Norman. On November 3rd, the official announcement was made, and it was too late for Norman to back out, even if he had been able to find the courage to make the attempt. Their house was sealed off. Secret Service agents made their appearance in the open, blocking off all approaches. At first the telephone rang incessantly, but Philip Handley, with an engaging, apologetic smile, took all calls. Eventually, the exchange shunted all calls directly to the police station. Norman imagined, in that way, he was spared not only the bubbling and envious congratulation of his friends, but also the egregious pressure of salesmen scenting a prospect and the designing smoothness of politicians from all over the nation. Perhaps even death threats from the inevitable crank. Newspapers were forbidden to enter the house now, in order to keep out weighted pressures. The television was gently but firmly disconnected, over Linda's loud protests. Matthew growled and stayed in his room. Linda, after the first flurry of excitement, sulked and whined because she could not leave the house. Sarah divided her time between preparation of meals for the present and plans for the future, and Norman's depression lived and fed upon itself. And the morning of Tuesday, November 4th, 2008 came at last, and it was Election Day. It was early breakfast, but only Norman Mueller ate, and that mechanically. Even a shower and a shave had not succeeded in either restoring him to reality or removing his own conviction that he was as grimy without as he felt grimy within. Handley's friendly voice did its best to shed some normality over the gray and unfriendly dawn. The weather prediction had been for a cloudy day with prospects of rain before noon. Handley said, "We'll keep this house insulated till Mr. Mueller is back, but after that, we'll be off your necks." The Secret Service agent was in full uniform now, including sidearms in heavily brassed holsters. "You've been no trouble at all, Mr. Handley," simpered Sarah. Norman drank through 2 cups of black coffee, wiped his lips with a napkin, stood up, and said haggardly, "I'm ready." Handley stood up too. "Very well, sir, and thank you, Mrs. Mueller, for your very kind hospitality." The armored car purred down empty streets. They were empty even for that hour of the morning. Handley indicated that and said, "They always shift traffic away from the line of drive ever since the attempted bombing that nearly ruined the Leverett election of '92. When the car stopped, Norman was helped out by the always polite Handley into an underground drive whose walls were lined with soldiers at attention. He was led into a brightly lit room in which 3 white-uniformed men greeted him smilingly. Norman said sharply, "But this is the hospital." "There's no significance to that," said Handley at once. "It's just that the hospital had the necessary facilities." Well, what do I do? Handley nodded. One of the 3 men in white advanced and said, I'll take over now, Agent. Handley saluted in an offhand manner and left the room. The man in white said, Won't you sit down, Mr. Mueller? I'm John Paulson, senior computer. These are Samson Levine and Peter Dorogobuz, my assistants. Norman shook hands numbly all about. Paulson was a man of middle height with a soft face that seemed unused to smiling and a very obvious toupee. He wore plastic-rimmed glasses of an old-fashioned cut, and he lit a cigarette as he talked. Norman refused his offer of one. Paulson said, In the first place, Mr. Mueller, I want you to know we are in no hurry. We want you to stay with us all day if necessary, just so that you get used to your surroundings and get over any thought you might have that there is anything unusual in this, anything clinical, if you know what I mean. It's all right, said Norman. I'd just as soon this were over. I understand your feelings. Still, we want you to know exactly what's going on. In the first place, Multivac isn't here. Isn't it? Somehow, through all his depression, he had still looked forward to seeing Multivac. They said it was 1/2 mile long and 3 stories high, that 50 technicians walked the corridors within its structures continuously. It was one of the wonders of the world. Paulson smiled. No, it's not portable, you know. It's located underground, in fact, and very few people know exactly where. You can understand that, since it's our greatest natural resource. Believe me, elections aren't the only thing it's used for. Norman thought he was being deliberately chatty and found himself intrigued all the same. I thought I'd see it. I'd like to. I'm sure of that, but it takes a presidential order, and even then, it has to be countersigned by security. However, we are plugged into Multivac right here, by beam transmission. Whatever Multivac says can be interpreted here, and what we say is beamed directly to Multivac. So in a sense, we're in its presence. Norman looked about. The machines within the room were all meaningless to him. Now let me explain, Mr. Mueller, Paulson went on. Multivac already has most of the information it needs to decide all the elections, national, state, and local. It needs only to check a certain imponderable attitudes of mind, and it will use you for that. We can't predict what questions it will ask, but they may not make much sense to you, or even to us. It may ask you how you feel about garbage disposal in your town, whether you favor central incinerators. It might ask you whether you have a doctor of your own, or whether you make use of National Medicine, Inc. Do you understand? Yes, sir. Whatever it asks, just answer in your own words in any way you please. If you feel you must explain quite a bit, do so. Take an hour, if necessary. Yes, sir. Now, one more thing. We will have to make use of some simple devices which will automatically record your blood pressure, heartbeat, skin conductivity, and brainwave pattern while you speak. The machine will seem formidable, but it's all absolutely painless. You won't even know it's on. The other 2 technicians were already busying themselves with smooth, gleaming apparatus on oiled wheels. Norman said, Is that to check on whether I'm lying or not? Not at all, Mr. Mueller. There's no question of lying. It's only a matter of emotional intensity. If the machine asks you your opinion of your child's school, you may say, I think it is overcrowded. Those are only words. From the way your brain and heart and hormones and sweat glands work, Multivac can judge exactly how intensely you feel about the matter. It will understand your feelings better than you yourself. I've never heard of this, said Norman. No, I'm sure you didn't. Most of the details of Multivac's workings are top secret. For instance, when you leave, you will be asked to sign a paper swearing that you will never reveal the nature of the questions you were asked, the nature of your responses, what was done, or how it was done. The less you know about the Multivac, the less chance of attempted outside pressure upon the men who service it, he said grimly. Our lives are hard enough as it is. Norman nodded. I understand. And now, would you like anything to eat or drink? No, nothing right now. Do you have any questions? Norman shook his head. Then you tell us when you're ready. I'm ready right now. You're certain? Quite. Paulson nodded and raised his hands in a gesture to the others. They advanced with their frightening equipment, and Norman Mueller felt his breath come a little quicker as he watched. The ordeal lasted nearly 3 hours, with one short break for coffee and an embarrassing session with a chamber pot. During all this time, Norman Mueller remained encased in machinery. He was bone-weary at the close. He thought sardonically that his promise to reveal nothing of what had passed would be an easy one to keep. Already the questions were a hazy mismatch in his mind. Somehow, he had thought Multivac would speak in a sepulchral human voice, resonant and echoing. But that, after all, was just an idea he had from seeing too many television shows, he decided now. The truth was distressingly undramatic. The questions were slips of a kind of metallic foil patterned with numerous punctures. A second machine converted the pattern into words, and Paulson read the words to Norman, then gave the question and let him read it for himself. Norman's answers were taken down by a recording machine, played back to Norman for confirmation, with emendations and added remarks also taken down. All that was fed into a pattern-making instrument, and that, in turn, was radiated to Multivac. The one question Norman could remember at the moment was the incongruously gossipy, "What do you think of the price of eggs?" Now it was over, and gently they removed the electrodes from various portions of his body, unwrapped the pulsating band from his upper arm, and moved the machinery away. He stood up, drew a deep, shuddering breath, and said, "Is that all? Am I through?" "Not quite." Paulson hurried to him, smiling in reassuring fashion. "We'll have to ask you to stay another hour." "Why?" asked Norman sharply. "It will take that long for Multivac to weave its new data into the trillions of items it has. Thousands of elections are concerned, you know. It's very complicated, and it may be that an odd contest here or there, a comptrollership in Phoenix, Arizona, or some council seat in Wilkesboro, North Carolina, may be in doubt. In that case, Multivac may be compelled to ask you a deciding question or two." "No," said Norman. "I won't go through this again. It probably won't happen," Paulson said soothingly. "It rarely does. But just in case, you'll have to stay." A touch of steel, just a touch, entered his voice. "You have no choice, you know. You must." Norman sat down wearily. He shrugged. Paulson said, "We can't let you read a newspaper, but if you'd care for a murder mystery, or you'd like to play chess, or if there's anything we can do for you to help pass the time, I wish you'd mention it." "It's all right. I'll just wait." They ushered him into a small room just next to the one in which he had been questioned. He let himself sink into a plastic-covered armchair and closed his eyes. As well as he could, he must wait out this final hour. He sat perfectly still, and slowly the tension left him. His breathing grew less ragged, and he could clasp his hands without being quite so conscious of the trembling of his fingers. Maybe there would be no questions. Maybe it was all over. If it were over, then the next thing would be the torchlight processions, and invitations to speak at all sorts of functions. The Voter of the Year. He, Norman Mueller, ordinary clerk of a small department store in Bloomington, Indiana, who had neither been born great nor achieved greatness, would be in the extraordinary position of having had greatness thrust upon him. The historians would speak soberly of the Mueller election of 2008. That would be its name, the Mueller election. The publicity, the better job, the flash flood of money that interested Sarah so much, occupied only a corner of his mind. It would all be welcome, of course. He couldn't refuse it, but at the moment, something else was beginning to concern him. A latent patriotism was stirring, after all. He was representing the entire electorate. He was the focal point for them. He was, in his own person, for this one day, all of America. The door opened, snapping him to open-eyed attention. For a moment, his stomach constricted. No more questions. But Paulson was smiling. "That will be all, Mr. Mueller." "No more questions, sir?" "None needed. Everything was quite clear-cut. You will be escorted back to your home, and then you will be a private citizen once more. Or as much as the public will allow." Thank you," Norman flushed and said. "I wonder, who was elected?" Paulson shook his head. "That will have to wait for the official announcement. The rules are quite strict. We can't even tell you. You understand." "Of course, yes." Norman felt embarrassed. "Secret Service will have the necessary papers for you to sign." Suddenly, Norman Mueller felt proud. It was on him now in full strength. He was proud. In this imperfect world, the sovereign citizens of the first and greatest electronic democracy had, through Norman Mueller, through him, exercised once again its free, untrammeled franchise.
For more on this episode, visit dataskeptic.com. If you enjoyed the show, please give us a review on iTunes or Stitcher.